How's everyone doing? Yeah, thanks for talking about JSConf and stuff. We made the wise decision not to have a 2010 event because it wouldn't have happened anyway. And this is actually my first conference, at least if counting community conferences, back from this bigger break in everyone's life. Yeah, I'm coming from San Francisco. I was actually in Germany before, still a little bit jet lagged, but I'm trying to bring up the vibes here a little bit. Yeah, so in this sense of reminiscing a little bit, 5 years ago at JSConf Australia, I gave a talk, and I started with this sentence: "Hello, I used to build very large JavaScript applications." I was still at Google at the time, and I was stepping into kind of an executive role, so I wasn't really actually building stuff myself, but I learned some stuff, and so I thought it would be a good idea to give a talk about it. But that was then. I'm back. I'm actually back to building things in JavaScript. They're very large applications. Obviously, nobody today actually does that anymore. It's TypeScript applications. And here we are. Another slide from that talk was that I thought React was good. And the context there was that back in the day, 10 years ago, I built a JavaScript framework at Google called Wiz. And I was thinking about whether to open source it. And so just around that time, React comes out, and it looks really good. And I think the world does not need this. I'm going to keep this to ourselves. I think now that it was a bit of a mistake, because there were some good contributions around scalability of applications that could have been actually valuable to the ecosystem, even if just kind of shown around. But now I'm at Vercel, I can kind of help a little bit, push React along, and I think with the stuff around server components, etc., some of this situation that we thought about at Google back in the day, has come around and is now available to everyone, which is amazing. Cool. All right. So I joined Vercel. I talk to all the teams, and I find that we have an internal DX team. And so I talk to them, what are you guys doing? They explain to me what they're doing. I think that seems like a really good idea. And then I go talk to customers. And our customers are telling me that their problems are the problems that our internal DX team is solving. And so I was like, why don't we turn this into a product team and actually make this available to everyone so that not everyone has to go over and over again, solve the same problems. Now, this is in a way relevant because the talk I gave back in the day, it was so such theory-heavy stuff because I didn't have anything open source. I could only tell folks this is what I learned, but you have to figure out how to take this learning into something real by yourself. Now, I'm going to be doing similar stuff today, and more power to you if you want to build yourself. We did announce a product called Vercel Spaces a few weeks ago that's trying to implement some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in a reusable fashion. All right, so let's go ship software like Google or Vercel, because it's 2023. But kind of going to Google, there was this guy called Eric Schmidt. He was the CEO for a long time. And he, at least internally, maybe I'm leaking something, sorry, always used to say, revenue solves all known problems. Basically saying, if you just make more money, it really doesn't matter what else you're doing. And I think that's wrong. Certainly we don't have infinite money. You don't have infinite money. I think Google no longer has infinite money. So that's not really, it's just not such a good mantra. But I think this one is actually true. Iteration velocity solves all known problems. What I mean is that when we make software, and that was actually the first talk today had a similar point, we are going to make mistakes over time, right? That's the only thing that we know is that the future is uncertain, and we have to deal with that fact professionally. And the way how you do that professionally is by being able, at the moment when you make that mistake, to react to it and iterate and do it right the second time around. So with that, right, let's think a little bit about our role in this and for the rest of this talk. So the senior engineer, or really what I mean is the lowercase c engineer, right? We've been around for a little bit. What do we do, right? You might have, there's a session later today around career advice. And they might tell you something like, if you want to have more impact, you need to scale beyond yourself. And what people kind of usually associate with this is something along the lines of kind of either having management responsibility or at least telling other folks what to do. It's a people thing, right? And so the rest of this talk is kind of about something very different from that. It's about how you can scale beyond yourselves, but through software that you build and through mechanisms that you establish in your teams that make the whole team better, but through the software that you're building. And so for the rest of these slides, basically, consider yourselves as like the hypothetical lead of the hypothetical platform team for your hypothetical, I don't know, 12, 50, 100-person engineering team, right? You're that person, and your job is to make that team scale better. Cool. That was a long intro. Anyway, I want to talk about principles for scaling front-end applications. I got 6. I have a bonus one, but I think I'm too slow, so I'll do 6. All right, so let's start with this one, tearing down the barriers. So this is actually something that was not clear to me how big of an effect it would have. As I was mentioning, I was like at Google for the longest time. I was not like using the tools everyone else was using, but I was, doing this conference, JSConf. I was going to these meetups myself, and I would hear folks on stage being incredibly excited about small modules, right? And there was a company called NPM, shout out NPM, who created something called private modules. And so people would go and in their company share code through publishing modules to NPM. And so I'm joining Vercel and I see that happening where like some team says, well, you have some cool code. Can you like publish that to NPM so I can use it? And then I have to update my package JSON to your new version. Maybe someone's helping me, maybe I'm doing this automatically. That's such an incredibly like bad process. And at scale, if you have a larger team, it really hurts, right? So my one kind of weird trick advice, if you haven't done it yet and you want to get that adrenaline shot in the arm, go migrate to a monorepo. Like it's really worth it. Now, obviously it comes with trade-off. Everything in software engineering comes with trade-off. Few months in, you'll notice, oh, like everyone can change everything. Maybe that isn't the best idea on the planet, right? But it's good to have a basis that encourages and puts a low barrier on collaboration, and you can deal with the problems that kind of come along the way. And there's certain scalability problems that, for example, GitHub Code Owners addresses. Now, that's kind of a weirdly not very great product among the other stuff at GitHub that's really good. So as part of our Spaces product, we're actually shipping something called Owners, which is basically like Code Owners, but like good. So check it out. All right, for the second principle, I'm calling this making it easy to delete code. Because there's one true thing about any large code base is that it will get larger. And that's in a way good, right? Like it's our job to write code. We're going to write code. There's nothing you can do about it. But we can, again, as the platform lead, professionally manage and encourage our engineers to have as little code as possible, and that includes deleting code. Now, if we all think about our code bases, there's probably something like this in there, right? There's some code that pretty obviously should not be there. 2017, whatever. And maybe that was originally a React component, and we got rid of that React component, right? But we had a CSS file that was also contributing to our 2017 Happy New Year message, and who knows whether that selector can be deleted, right? That's really like almost a halting problem type of problem, and so it kind of lingers around. Now, on the other hand, if you're using something like Tailwind or CSS like NJS libraries, because you have co-location of the CSS with the code, you can just delete the whole thing with high confidence, get rid of it. And again, like this is the type of thinking you should have as the lead to say like, that's why I'm making this choice of using something like Tailwind, because it actually makes it easier to delete code. As another good example of this type of thinking, I think is data fetching inside of components in Next.js 13. So in this example, we have a tweet component, right? And we only pass the ID. The tweet component fetches its own data. Now, if we delete that tweet component, everything's gone. Remember how this worked in like legacy Next.js or something like remix loaders? Data fetching is hoisted to the top of the route. So if I delete something that's very far down my React render tree, I have to remember to also delete the data fetching code. And if you have a large team, someone will forget some of the time. And it'll not only make your application kind of larger and have unnecessary stuff in it, but it will also make it substantially slower, or in the case of data fetching, even like introduce cost, because you're calling some backend system that you really don't have to call. So again, it's kind of the same idea of CSS and JS, it's just for data fetching in JS. And I know some folks like say, well, that doesn't scale, blah, blah, blah. Like one of my, I think, accomplishment at Google that I'm most proud of was introducing exactly this. And so any larger Google app that you've been using over like the last 8 or so years is using exactly this technique, where you have data fetching in the render tree as opposed to data fetching in some like hoisted, pseudo scalable fashion. All right, principle number 3, always migrate incrementally. I was joking on Twitter the other day that there's basically just 2 types of migrations. There's the incremental ones and there's the failed ones. Now sometimes you start out with this big plan and you're going to say like, we're going to do this all at once. But I think more often than not, maybe you're like 3 months in and your boss comes and says, this is all fine and good, but we can't wait 6 more months to prove that this is going to work. I need to ship something next week or next month, right? And so something that started out as potentially, big bang type of migration typically eventually starts to become something that you do incrementally. And so it's ideally better to just plan it from the start. As just an example for the type of thinking that goes into API design to make it incremental migration possible, I think another good example is once again the Next.js 13 app router, where you can go and migrate a single route at a time, lift and shifting it into the new world, right? So no one's forcing you to say old API or new API. You can have that page on this API, this page on that API, and kind of work you through the code base. And even further down in that project, here we have like some get server-side props, legacy. Shouldn't I say legacy? I don't know, whatever. Old API, right? Which you perfectly fine still to use. But that's how it looked. And then you can do the first migration step. And note that this is like a trivial migration, right? Nothing really changed. We just took that code that was in get server-side props and put it into our top-level component. Now, is that better than before? No, it's not. Right? But it's an incremental step where you didn't like have to rewrite your entire render tree to take advantage of some of the new capabilities. And again, just an example for how to make APIs that can be migrated in this like step-by-step fashion rather than doing everything at once. And obviously, shout out to the Next.js team who actually did a good job at this, I think. Cool. Moving on to principle number 4. Which is always getting better and never getting worse. This is actually, in a way, kind of related to the topic of incremental migration, but a little bit more general. So one good example for how you ensure that your application kind of has a certain standard would be by introducing lint rules, right? Which say, in my app, you have to do it this way, not the other way. Now, what happens sometimes, which isn't so great, something like this, which, by the way, I just randomly copy-pasted from Vercel's internal super secret code base, so I'm sorry if anything interesting is in there. The actually interesting parts are the comments, which basically disable lint rules all over the place, right? And actually, I think that's good. I'll talk about why this is the right way to do it. But obviously, it sucks to litter your code base with these comments, which add no value, right? But in a way, these comments are now this ledger of technical debt, right? Technical debt usually is this like super abstract thing. But here you have a list, a to-do list of things you want to fix. Now, again, this kind of is nasty to your code base, which is why for our Spaces product, what we're using are these external kind of allow lists that don't litter your code base. You basically have a JSON file that says, there's some rules here, and in this file, it's okay to violate the rules. Now, coming back to kind of the theme of getting better, not getting worse, What you really want to see for your team's code base is a graph like this. These violations over time. And you want to kind of let this come down over time. And then you see these like, steps up. That's actually not bad. That's when you introduce a new rule, right? And you allow list all existing violations, and then as this code actually gets touched, it gets better over time. And I want to encourage everyone to allow list this stuff, right? It's not actually important to migrate everything and put it into the new state. The reason is that, and this is actually something that wasn't obvious to me early in my career at all, that if you have something like some rule over your app, the marginal value of that rule is drastically higher on new code than it is on the old code. Because your old code is battle tested. It went through QA, it went through production outages, right? It went through users having creative ideas about what a name is. Like, you fixed all these things already, right? And so you likely actually won't find anything interesting. The reason why these rules exist is that when you write something new, at that moment, it tells you right away, hey, you're making a mistake, go fix it now, right? Where it's also really cheap to do it. And so that's why it's so important to quickly get these opinions into your code base for future code, and it's not important to now take out, a month out of your life to migrate everything you already have to the new state. So I talked a little bit about, like, in the abstract fashion about rules like this, and I gave this lint rule example, but actually think, I want to talk about something slightly higher level than a lint rule, which is kind of associated with code style and stuff like this. So, but coming to the principle, embrace lack of knowledge. Again, you're the lead of this like larger team. There's going to be people who are new to your team. There's going to be people who are more junior. They're going to have, some context about that code base that they're lacking, that they can't know, or that they missed, or where they didn't read the memo, right? This all happens. And we as leaders of that team, we have to embrace that they might not have that context. And so that's why it's important to try to encode as many of these things that you know about your code base in some machine-readable fashion. I have an example here of what that means. And again, this goes way beyond like linting, but more into like application design opinions. This is a rule, again, like taken from Vercel's internal code base. And so we use Next.js middleware, and which is a very powerful tool, right? It runs on almost all requests we're serving. And that means if our middleware is slow, our site's going to be very slow, right? And one way how you can make your middleware really slow is by fetching something from some other service, right? On the other hand, fetching something from some other service might be exactly what you want to do, right? Because that's how you do interesting things, like you call services. Now, which means that, yes, you sometimes have to call a service, but no, sometimes it's not the right idea, right? And so with an allow list mechanism like this, what you can do is you can say, by default, making this change requires approval by someone who actually has the context to make the decision whether in this context this is the right idea. And this kind of combines this idea of an allow list external to the code together with the owner's mechanism that we have, where the owner for the allow list is not the same person who's writing the code, and respectively you can easily enforce that you get your architect or lead of the platform team type of person to go take a second look and validate that in this case, yes, it's an okay usage. And then again, like, this is not like the lint rule where you eventually probably want to get code base and uniform code base. Here, you just ensure that, yes, we did take a look, and this is actually what we want to do. Cool. Moving to the final principle here, eliminating systematic complexity. Once again, you're the person who's leading the platform team for your organization, and you're seeing stuff that people struggle with. Every so often, I think it's important to take a step back and make a catalog of what these things that people like struggle with all the time, and try to get rid of that problem once and for all by introducing some kind of abstraction that makes it possible to just not worry about it anymore. One, I think, good example for this type of issue is what, at least in big tech, is called version skew. So version skew is something that happens in distributed systems when you have a client and a server, and they're not at the same version, right? Now, you might say, I'm a front engineer, I don't write distributed systems, and you're wrong. Like, you're actually doing the hard mode, right? Like, because on a data center, you control how things are deployed, right? You know how that works, you can put rules around it. On the other hand, when you have a web client and a server, you're not in control when that web client redeploys, right? User goes to your site, and they might stick around, right? Certainly for like a while. Meanwhile, you redeploy your server. So now you have this our old client, new server, and you're introducing a new field in your API, and the client has no idea, right? And so this is a problem that you have to manage now. Now, there's almost like an entire ecosystem around this, like, for example, the Zot library for TypeScript, or the TRPC layer on top of it, which allows you to express expectations around your APIs and handle the problem if those expectations aren't met. But that's a lot of complexity, right? There's a lot of stuff you have to do. And what do you do if you don't get the field, right? Like, what do you actually do? It's a hard problem. And so we were seeing this issue at Vercel, and we were wondering, can we, again, eliminate the whole systematic problem? And so what we did was we said, hey, we have this serverless product, right? And we don't have one server with the latest version. We can actually serve other versions of your site than the latest deployment. And so what we have now is a very experimental version, but we were rolling it out over the next weeks, is that you can opt in to a mode in Next.js where the server that responds to your client will always be exactly the one version that the client was at, which means you can just forget about this whole problem altogether. You never have to worry about it again. In particular with server actions, which are already like function calls, they're really like function calls now because you actually know which functions you're calling, right? It's not like some abstract version of something named this, but you don't know which one. It's going to be exactly that. And so again, this is just an example of the type of stuff you can do to make it easier to build applications at scale. Amazing. That's all I had today. This is the whole list. I don't have to go through it again. I think we have Q&A. Maybe it'll be helpful with questions and stuff. Thank you very much.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions, so let's get right to it. There's a question here that I find really interesting, but I want to expand on it a little. The question, as asked, is, you mentioned to always migrate incrementally, but what about using ASTs to automatically migrate huge amounts of code? And to that, sort of talk a little bit about when is it worth automating things? Is it a benefit? Is it a distraction?
No, it's definitely worth automating things, but even if you automate a change, I would still apply the principle. So at Google, there's a robot called Rosie, and it will take your 15,000 line change and turn it into 15,000 one-line change and manage applying it into your code base in an incremental fashion so that you don't have to then eventually say, oh shit, I made one mistake, and you have to roll back the 15,000 line change. So I think it's, it kind of recursively applies.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Remove the barriers, Google. This, topical, of course, for Vercel stuff is, what are your thoughts on server components? Is it the future, etc.?
What are my thoughts on server components? They are the future. So what I'm actually excited about are server actions. So I'm excited about the client and server growing together in a way this feels natural and seamless and like one world instead of two worlds.
And the last question is for me, which is, what was the 7th principle?
Can we go back? No, the 7th principle was around how to bring change into organizations, around making sure that when you actually have a new idea, like this version skew stuff, that you don't come from your ivory tower and say, this is what you're using now, but you have a customer 0 who tries it out, then you have a customer 1 who tries it by themselves but still has your help, and then you have a customer 2 who tries to only do it with the docs and so forth.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Malta's going to be in the speaker booth in the back if you have any more questions or just want to get some one-on-one time. Thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
For that wonderful talk.